Chapter 10. By now, Esther was starting to show signs of her old personality from the Georgetown days. Thankfully, she was calmer, friendlier, more relaxed. In retrospect, I guess I can see what happened. Teenage years already are tough on humans, right? And then when a teenager gets uprooted from home and has to acclimate to a new home, a new life, everyone knows a lot of teens in that situation start acting out. And goodness knows Esther is about as human-like as any animal you've ever met. She was going through a phase, I figure. It was no fun for her and definitely no fun for us. But we survived it. I was so happy to have my baby girl back, and it wasn't a moment too soon. I'd been ever more concerned that we had caused her so much trouble our first few months here that we'd never see the old Esther again. For a while, I thought I'd be forever rejected by her, treated the same way she treats the vet. It always made me laugh when Esther got strange with the vet. She wouldn't let him get near her, all because he had given her a needle one time. You know that old saying, an elephant never forgets? I swear it applies to pigs too. Their memories are incredible. For example, when we lived in Georgetown, before the move, Esther once got into a box of Cheerios in the cupboard and took it into the living room. We managed to get most of them away from her, and then we sent her to the backyard so we could finish cleaning up. Good luck ever trying to clean up after a 650-pound pig while she's still on site. She stayed out for well over an hour, having settled in for a yard nap after her customary rooting session in one of my once incredible perennial gardens. As soon as she came back inside, she went straight for the living room where we had confiscated the cereal, and proceeded to use her snout to lift the couch so she could inspect underneath for lingering Cheerios. She didn't miss a beat, and that's how it always went. No matter how long it had been since something occurred, she remembered. It was the same with the vet. She associated him with a bad experience, and no matter what, she wasn't going to forget it. Aside from the battles we would have in the forest, Esther rarely challenged us, or one of the house animals, for much of anything. Occasionally, we'd see a little scuffle over the bed or who was going to finish the last kibble in the dog bowl. You know, the one that was sitting there all day until someone else expressed an interest in it, and now everyone wanted it. But that peaceful, easy feeling lasted only a short while. Yes, she was doing fine with her two dads, thank everything that is holy, but then she started showing some bold behavior with the other animals. Previously, Shelby had been the top dog. She ruled the roost as far as where she wanted to eat and sleep. If Shelby was laying in the middle of the room, Esther would walk completely around her, and Esther also gave Shelby plenty of space to eat at dinner time. But as time passed at the farm, we started to see a little glimmer of a rivalry between Esther and Shelby, mostly stemming from Esther. Shelby's spot was in front of the sliding door. She loved to lie on the tiles once they'd been warmed up by the sun over the course of the day. It was probably much like a heating pad for her muscles, which at 17 years old must have been getting a little stiff. But now, instead of just walking around Shelby or waiting for her to move, Esther would plow right through. Shelby wasn't used to this kind of behavior, so she would stand her ground with zero intention of moving, but that didn't matter to Esther. She was going where she wanted, whether Shelby moved or not. On more than one occasion, Esther stepped on Shelby's tail or knocked Shelby over as she barged on through. Esther was clearly starting to throw her weight around within our family herd structure. She was trying to move up in rank. We didn't know this until we got to the farm, but family structure means everything in groups. The whole alpha concept is just as true for pigs as it is for dogs and humans. There's always a top hog, and the others fall in line. At some point, the top hog gets up there in age, and a younger one will challenge for top position. It's a common trait of pack animals, and it's not pretty to watch. It's no secret that Esther is a big girl. And when you have a 650-pound animal literally throwing her weight around, either you move or you get hurt. We understood that. But Shelby, who's all of 75 pounds soaking wet, wasn't catching the hint. For months, we had been worried about losing our relationship with Esther due to her behavior, but we hadn't expected to also deal with a reshuffling of ranks within our group of four-legged family members. Derek and I had always assumed we were the bosses, but Esther had other plans, and they were adding yet another new dynamic to our family. Around the same time, things were also starting to get a bit crazy in the barn. For the first time ever, we had to deal with multiple herds of pigs out there. Initially, it was just Dan, Leonard, Bobby, and Bear, and they got along beautifully. We had recently added April. She had gone into quarantine upon arrival, only to have her babies a few days later, well before we were able to do any integrating between April and the other pigs. The arrival of her piglets meant we would need to maintain the two herds indefinitely. Dan and his piggy pals had been together for years, having arrived in unison from another sanctuary, but April didn't have a connection to Dan's group. Her mothering instincts were taking over, and she was ready to throw down any time one of the other pigs came near her stall or walked up to the fences when her piglets were outside. We could tell the two herds weren't making friends with each other, and with the piglet situation, we decided we weren't going to even try to form one combined herd. They were two distinct family groups, and it looked like it would stay that way. Space already was getting tight in there, and our experience with Esther told us it wasn't going to be very long before April and her crew outgrew their stall. We had just finished preparing space for BJ and Escalade, along with making sure the other pigs had a secure pasture to explore. We now realized we would need even more space in the very near future. It hadn't even been a full year yet, and already we were approaching capacity for our barn. Because the weather was warming up, we were able to move BJ and Escalade from the barn into the pasture where the cows lived. That freed up a little space in the barn, which became the perfect place for our quickly expanding goat herd to live. With everybody's temporary living arrangements sorted out, we started planning our first barn build. Our cows had not yet come into the barn, even when they had direct access. They seemed to prefer being outside, so we decided to build in the pasture behind the barn for our largest residence, moving the goats into BJ and Escalade's old space. We looked online for design ideas and eventually decided on a 24 by 16 foot board and batten building with a sheet metal roof. We used 6 by 6 inch posts, so you literally drove a truck into the building. I suspect the truck would come out in worse condition than the building. It looks amazing, and the new addition finally allowed us to spread everyone out a little bit, taking advantage of some of the still unused land we had available. I know we hadn't been at the farm very long, at least in the big picture, but my mind moves a million miles a minute, and no matter how fast we worked, I always felt we could do more. We had barely scratched the surface of what was available to us and the animals, and sometimes it felt like such a battle to reclaim the neglected space. It was incredibly satisfying when we did it, and watching animals explore an area that had been animal-free for the better part of 3 decades was an amazing experience. But as soon as we finished one space, I'd look past that field into the one beyond, noticing all the fallen trees and broken fences. It seemed like every moment of celebration was interrupted by the realization that we had barely even started on what we ultimately needed to do out there. Regardless, we knew to celebrate the small victories and not let ourselves get too overwhelmed with the upcoming workload. As everyone got settled into their new living arrangements, we felt a huge weight lift from our shoulders. We have really thick skin, but when you put your life on social media, everybody becomes an expert on everything you do. We felt like we were constantly being judged for our actions. I don't know about you, but the daily caloric intake for a horse is a complete mystery to me, or was before we got a horse. We were always very aware of what we posted online because we didn't want to get dragged into an argument with someone or have to defend ourselves. We had too much to do, and all of it was more important than dealing with internet trolls. But that's par for the course. It's something you accept when you open up your life to the world, and ultimately, nothing was really happening that could have caused us a problem. Until suddenly something did. Derek went out to the barn one afternoon and discovered what looked like a scene from a 90s slasher movie. There was blood all over the walls, on the doors, and in the straw. Derek immediately called for me over his walkie-talkie, and just from how upset he sounded, I knew I needed to get there fast. I came running out of the house and into the barn, and I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me when I got my first glimpse of the scene. Derek had already headed out the back door towards the forest, so without really getting a good look at what happened or who was in there, I ran through the barn and out the back door, hopped the gate into the pig's pasture, and followed Derek through the gate into the woods. That's where we found Leonard, lying on the ground with a gash in his leg that was about 8 inches long and an inch deep. My first thought, I had been working on fencing the day before, and I left a small section at the very end only partially secured. It was nailed to the post, but there were little wire ends a foot long that still needed to wrap around and secure. In the moment, I was sure Leonard had been caught by one of the wires, that this horrible injury was entirely my fault. I was so upset, and even more so because I expected Derek was about to yell at me, until I saw Dan walk out of the barn in equally distressing condition. This hadn't been any fencing accident. It was a pig fight. Leonard had unquestionably been head of the pig herd, so much so that we never even considered that Dan might challenge him for top position. But Dan must have seen signs of weakness in Leonard and planned to capitalize on it, much as Esther was doing with Shelby. Male pigs such as Dan and Leonard have massive tusks, with tips as sharp as razor blades. The pigs use their heads like wrecking balls and will slam those tusks into an opponent as a defense mechanism. We don't know how this particular clash started, but it ended in a fight so serious that poor Leonard was too scared to even go back to the barn. Dan clearly had come out on top of this particular melee, so we used kibble to lure him inside. Once we got him under control, we turned our attention to Leonard. We wanted to get him into the old barn where BJ and Escalade lived before moving in with the cows. While there's never a good time for a pig fight, we were at least thankful this had happened when it had, and not a month earlier when the barn was still totally full. After a bit, we secured Leonard and Dan in separate stalls while we waited for the vet to arrive. Derek and I stayed in the barn, offering both of our injured fighters watermelon and grapes to keep their spirits up. But poor Leonard was having none of it. I noted how expressive pigs are with their faces, particularly their eyes. Seeing Leonard after the fight was absolutely heartbreaking. He was usually so lively and enthusiastic, but now his hung head low, a look of total despair on his face. He had been defeated, and we didn't realize it at the time, but he'd never spend time with his lifelong friends again. His reign as king of the herd was over. He was devastated, and so were we. Until then, we'd only seen such despair on the faces of pigs when looking at photos of them on livestock trailers or at commercial farms. The vet arrived and promptly confirmed that both pigs would require stitches. Leonard's wounds, he said, might even include muscle damage. The gash had gone clear through the skin and the heavy layer of fat pigs have, right into the leg muscles. That explained why Leonard was having such a hard time walking. The pain must have been excruciating. He couldn't stand up on that side. And as we know from our experience with Esther, leg and foot injuries are not to be taken lightly with pigs. At Leonard's age and size, a bad leg could kill him. The doctor immediately started stitching up the wounds. Dan went first because his were far less severe. Then it was Leonard's turn. During the procedure, the vet also suggested we trim both Leonard's and Dan's tusks to help prevent this from happening in the future. Removing pigs' tusks is a common practice in commercial settings. It's usually done while they're piglets, by brute force. Believe it or not, here's what a staff member at one of the animal hospitals said to us. You know how we did that in my day? With a baseball bat. He accompanied this lovely comment with a gesture toward my face as if he were jamming the end of a bat into my mouth. It sent shivers up my spine and brought to mind how Esther must have lost her tail, most likely to a pair of pliers at the hand of some farm laborer. Luckily, female pigs don't have tusks anywhere near the size of those on males, so it's not quite the same issue with Esther. We didn't need to worry about trimming her tusks, because they simply weren't big enough to pose a serious problem. But Dan and Leonard are very well equipped to fight if need be, and we just witnessed firsthand how dangerous that could be. Dr. Kirkham explained the process of trimming the tusks, reassuring us that it was 100% painless. However, he warned us they'll scream like jetliners. He continued, "You're not going to like it. It's not pretty, but I promise it won't hurt them." He explained the procedure thoughtfully, knowing we are extremely sensitive when it comes to our animals. He showed us the tool he was going to use. It was basically a long metal wire with small wooden handles on either end. It acts like a snare, looping over the pig's snout and top jaw and tightening. This causes the pig to freak out and try to escape by backing up, and this is where the jetliner thing comes in. The pig goes into complete panic mode, but once it hits the wall and has nowhere else to go, it just stands there, still, with its mouth open, shrieking at an ear-piercing level. It honestly sounds like torture. Then the wire is used as a saw to cut the tusk above the nerve, similar to trimming a fingernail. Once the tusks are cut, the snare comes off and the pig stops screaming and wanders off like nothing ever happened. So the tusk cutting itself is very easy. It's the snaring part that sucks. And Dr. Kirkham was right. We didn't like it one bit. After all the stories I've told about panicking anytime any one of my animals dealt with any sort of trauma, did you think there was any chance I could shake this off? I might be getting a little better about handling these things, purely out of necessity, but let's face facts. All of my animals are family to me, and to Derek as well, and we can't stand seeing any of our children in pain or fear. Unfortunately, this had to be done, at least in Dan's case. We knew there wasn't any other choice. If Dan and Leonard clashed again, Dan might just end up killing him. So you do what you have to do. The vet trimmed Dan's tusks first, and the procedure went pretty smoothly, all things considered. As for Leonard, even though we know the process itself wasn't a big deal, we were also considering Leonard's injured leg. We didn't want to cause him any panic that might lead to his injuring himself even more, so we decided not to trim his tusks at the time. The situation with the two pigs was bad enough that we knew we couldn't chance another fight. So we planned to keep Leonard with Bear and move Dan and Bobby into their own space. In determining the logistics of who would go where, we immediately got to work securing the next pasture over. The plan was to move the goats from the old barn to the cow pasture, move the cows to the new pasture, and put Dan and Bobby in the old barn. That left April and her babies in the same spot, with Leonard and Bear in the same space they had previously shared with Dan and Bobby. Did you follow all that? We were having just as hard a time wrapping our heads around all the shuffling, but there was no alternative. The pressure was on to prep the new pasture as quickly as possible so we could get everyone moved. Our brand new cow barn was now taken over by goats and sheep, so that left the cows without shelter again. Yet another item to add to our growing to-do list. Had it been winter, we would have had serious problems on our hands. But it was spring, so we had a few months to get another barn built. We focused on sorting the fences. Just a few days after the fight, the Great Migration began. We moved Leonard into Bear's stall and put Dan and Bobby in the old barn, which had its own little pasture. The goats settled into their nice new barn, and the cows took full advantage of their massive new pasture, even though it was still missing a barn. All this time, things had been getting more complicated with our volunteer Ruth. We tried to remain hopeful that we could work through her control issues, but things were getting out of hand. It's one thing to act questionably on your own time. It's a whole other ballgame when it happens right on the farm. Ruth started making her own rules. She really was taking over. During public days, she would carry on as if the sanctuary were hers, telling people where they could go and what they could do. It was becoming very troubling for us, because her judgment was questionable, a few times when incidents involving the animals occurred. Lord knows we had more than our fair share of fencing. We had kept the goats in a fenced-in forested pasture for weeks without difficulty. But pigs aren't goats, and when we let some pigs in, we learned that they were way too strong for the fencing we had in there. After the weekend when the pigs escaped, we left a note on Monday that asked Ruth not to let the pigs out. But she decided to let them out anyway. When we got to the barn and saw the pigs weren't in their stall, we immediately knew what had happened. Derek yelled for Ruth and asked where the pigs were. As soon as she started speaking, he cut her off. "The fences are down." Derek immediately ran out the back of the barn toward the pen. Before we even got there, we could see the fence was even more bent than usual, and the pigs were gone. The pigs had crossed the service road and gone down into the ravine. It was super rocky, very steep, and covered in dense bush. Not ideal pig terrain, much less people searching for pigs terrain. Within a few minutes, we located a few of the piglets in the ravine and started directing them back up toward the barn. They were pretty easy to move, thankfully not at all like Esther when we had our forest fights. Just as we rounded the corner with 3 of the 5 piglets, we saw the other 2 coming down the path between the 2 pastures immediately beside our barn. They were heading straight for Esther, who had since woken up and decided to join us outside for breakfast. Here's the issue with that. Esther had never met another pig before without a fence separating her from the other pig. We knew she didn't like other pigs, and all of a sudden, there were way more pigs than people in attendance, with nothing to keep the pigs apart. My heart was in my throat, expecting it to become a literal battle. Esther was dramatically bigger than the piglets. She could injure or even kill several of them in a matter of seconds. Yes, she's a sweetheart in most instances. But all of that goes out the window when it's a pig versus pig situation. That's just the nature of pigs. Mercifully, Esther seemed as perplexed about the situation as everyone else was. She honked and spun around as the piglets came running from all directions, but they went right past her and into the barn. Afterward, Derek went to have words with Ruth. Things escalated to a yelling match, and Derek told her she was no longer welcome at the farm. It was hard on everyone. We knew Ruth had been trying to help, but we couldn't take chances when it came to the safety of our animals, and the piglet situation could have turned out so much worse. We were incredibly lucky that no one was hurt. Our experience with Ruth led to the creation of a volunteer coordinator position, a thorough review of our policies surrounding who comes to the farm, and very specific guidelines covering what can and cannot be done. It was sad to lose Ruth, but it was a beneficial learning experience in moving forward with the sanctuary. We had to focus on dealing with the pig situation. We had figured for a while that we would need to create another pig herd at some point, but we always assumed that would consist of splitting up April and her piglets once the babies got a little older. Susie Costin at Farm Sanctuary had warned us that fights among pigs were almost guaranteed, but we'd figured that would consist of the piglets eventually trying to establish their roles in the herd. But then Dan and Leonard surprised us with their fight. It was yet another huge learning experience for us. With them split up, we now had 3 pig herds, plus the potential of another looming battle among April's offspring. There was no time to relax. We needed to prepare for a 4th herd. This looked like it would be a never-ending cycle. We figure we'll just need to keep building as we bring in more animals. Eat, Piggaroo? Crazy piglets.